run any BIOS instructions. You see, there has to be processing that takes place with those instructions, so the BIOS passes them off to the processor and it goes ahead and performs. Then we can load the video ROM and any other ROM that we have, like SCSI that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and then we'll have a hardware inventory in comparison. A good example of that would be maybe the last time you properly booted up this computer, you had one stick of memory in that system, maybe a gigabyte stick of memory. Now you've gone ahead and upgraded it. You took the cover off, put in another stick of 1 gig memory. Now you have a total of 2 gigs of memory. Put the cover back on, power up the computer, and it will then, in current BIOS that is, detect automatically that you have upgraded the memory. It may give you a brief message identifying that it can detect that new memory, but in many cases it just goes on about its business, assuming that the 2 gigabytes is okay, and it will go ahead and proceed as normal. Otherwise, you might get a message that says that there's been a change to the hardware, in this case the memory, and please go into the CMOS settings and make the changes appropriately. And you may have to manually go in and tell it how much memory it has. But once again, most current motherboards are pretty easy to work with there, and it's mostly automated now. Also, if you do a cold start of the computer, and this means that the power is completely turned off, you walk in, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, you hit the power switch. That's a cold start, as opposed to doing something like Control-Alt-Delete or clicking Start and then turn off computer or restart, something like that. That would be a warm boot. This is a cold start, and when that happens, it'll normally run a RAM test, and you'll see the numbers clicking, usually in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, and it counts up the amount of memory that it has. Some systems will have a splash screen instead, which conceals those kinds of things from you. That might be referred to as some manufacturers as quick boot, or words to that effect, maybe fast boot. It'll also do then, of course, its post, which we've already discussed. And again, it does those two things during a cold start. During a warm start, it just bypasses the RAM test and the post because it doesn't think that's going to be necessary, since it already ran the RAM test and the post when you cold started it earlier. Now, what will often happen is that the BIOS will get updated. Now, this is probably not going to be updated as often as your Windows operating system, which seems to have many updates every month. But the BIOS, probably every few months, will have an update to it. And this will take place because the manufacturer has determined that there's some kind of a fix that they need to do, or some kind of compatibility issue that they need to resolve. So very often they, again, might be bug fixes. Now, BIOS, in terms of programming and as far as that's concerned, they're relatively simple. So there's not too many bug fixes out there anymore. They're usually pretty well written. But that could happen, and then you could also have issues with hardware compatibility. Maybe you have a specific video card that every time you play a specific game, for example, it just seems to lock the system up. Well, that might be because of a BIOS issue. Maybe if a update to the BIOS would resolve that issue for you. Or there might be new technologies. So, for example, some motherboards originally came out in terms of all their connections and everything with the ability to run USB 2.0. And we'll talk more about that later on, but USB 2.0 is much, much faster than USB 1.0. Well, at the time the BIOS was written, the standard wasn't completed yet, so the manufacturer might have only included BIOS settings for USB 1.0. Now that the standard has been finalized, they can rewrite their BIOS and include technology for USB 2.0, and that's just an example. Then, once you do that update to the BIOS, you might be able to get USB 2.0 instead. Now, one thing that I want to point out here is that despite all the reasons why you might want to update the BIOS, as a general rule, and this is just me, this is not an A+ objective, my thinking is, if it's not broken, what's the rest of the story there? You got it. Don't fix it. And I simply take that approach because if everything's working just fine, why mess with a good thing? It could be that if I update the BIOS, maybe I'll have a power outage or something will get interrupted, or there'll be some other issue, and I might make the system worse rather than better. That's just my thinking in terms of the BIOS upgrades. I have a different approach to things like Windows updates, which are very often security related. I usually get all of those just almost sight unseen because they're usually pretty vital to the system. But we'll talk about those also when we talk about updating Windows later on. Well, how are we going to update the BIOS? There's a couple of different methods. Number one, from within the operating system, which is typically going to be Windows in a A+ environment, what you can do is to use the web and go to the manufacturer's website to download the latest version of the BIOS for your motherboard. And then what will often happen is it'll be a zip file or an executable. What you'll do is to extract the executable or to double click on the executable, and then it will launch instructions for you. It might just tell you that you need to put a floppy disk into the disk drive, and it will copy all the files necessary to that floppy. And then what you're supposed to do is to boot from that floppy, at which point it'll automatically update the BIOS. So that's one way of doing it. And as I just mentioned, then it would create a DOS boot disk that would copy all the files to it that you'd boot from. The other method there could possibly be with really recent versions of motherboards and BIOSes is that you can double click on the executable from within Windows, and then you don't have to do much of anything. All you have to do now is the next time your computer restarts, it'll have files on the hard drive that'll automatically reference, and it'll automatically use those files to update the BIOS. And then once the BIOS is updated, it reboots the computer automatically again, and it will boot automatically right into Windows as usual after that. And let me tell you, that sure beats the way it was in the old days, where you'd have to replace the whole chip at once, and you'd have to use these special kind of tweezers or pliers, if you will. They're called a chip puller, and you'd have to pull out the old BIOS, and you'd have to put the new one in, and that was lots of fun. Plus, it usually had some expense involved, whereas the updates from the BIOS manufacturers is usually free. And then here I've simply gone to Dell's website. I am running a Dell server. Yeah, I'm running server hardware, but I'm running a desktop operating system on it. The only reason why I'm doing that is because I don't really need fancy graphics for the computer that you're looking at right now, but I do need Windows XP to demonstrate many of the things I'm going to show you. And I like the reliability of the server hardware from Dell. So I can click on Solutions for Small Business, and whichever your manufacturer is, it's going to be a similar function to what you're seeing right here. And then I can go up here to Support, and then I want to identify the drivers and downloads that I need, so I'll click there. Then I can click Find My Service Tag. This is useful because if it can put in the service tag number there, then it will be able to identify exactly which model I've got without me having to run around to the back of the computer and trying to find some obscure service tag that, with my failing aged eyes, I won't be able to read, and it's in dim light, and it's dusty and dirty back there. So I'll just click Find My Service Tag. And then I can agree to a licensing agreement because there's a Dell ActiveX control that will search my system to examine my computer to find my service tag and my express service code. And this will also be automatically filled in here now. And it's very specific service tag. It's unique so that only my computer has it. And it identifies it uniquely to Dell. And then I can say, I'm looking for a download for my BIOS. And then I can choose Find Downloads, and it will show to me Flash BIOS updates. That's what we call these, by the way. When you can double-click on an executable or run something like that I just described a moment ago and have it installed for you without having to replace the chip. Then it'll go to Dell Server System BIOS, and it will identify the name of the file, when it was last updated. I think it's going to show me down here somewhere. When it was last updated. I guess I have to click it. There it is, updated in April. And then it will also identify, and this is the good stuff, what fixes and enhancements have been applied. Now, this is where I was saying, if it's not broken, don't fix it. But if I'm having some trouble with one of my devices, then maybe this update would fix it. For example, maybe I'm having trouble with some USB 1.1 and 2.0 devices. Some of the USB devices aren't properly detected, or I have a USB 2.0 device that's only being detected as a USB 1.1 device. Something like that could be the issue. So lots of different things here that looks like it's going to fix. This actually looks like a good update for me. So I'm going to go ahead and download that. I'm going to click it right here, and I'm going to go ahead and save it to my desktop. Now, it's an executable. As I mentioned earlier, this is something that I can then double-click on to go ahead and install it on my system. And so then I'll simply double-click on this and choose to run this update, and then it gives me some summary information here. It tells me my existing BIOS information, version A02, and I'm going to upgrade to A04. And do I want to continue with this? I'll click on Continue. And am I sure I want to do this? It's going to close all applications, shut down Windows, flash the BIOS, and then reboot. Okay. Now here I am back in Windows again, and it might sound kind of abrupt in the recording here. What happened is it had to restart the computer. Of course, I have to stop recording when that happens, so I was left without any way of recording and showing you. But just so you know, it did upgrade from A02 to A04 at the first boot. It took less than 5 seconds to do that. And then it rebooted again back into Windows, and now we have a successfully flashed BIOS. Now, once again, I don't normally do this unless I have a good reason. My main reason really here was because I wanted to show it to you. But just so you know, I don't flash my BIOS for just anybody. Notice also that I did not go to Phoenix BIOS or Amy BIOS or any of the